And then I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, Steve, can you see that? Sounds good to me. Brian, Steve, feel free to add anything if you think that there's something that needs to be added. Otherwise, I'll just get started. So this is cross-examination. Chances are you've probably never done cross-examination before, but at big tournaments like nationals, Harvard, Glenbrooks, and like the final rounds of a lot of those big national circuit tournaments, they'll employ cross-examination. So it's a really useful thing to know, especially if you have aspirations to become a better extemper. And so having a good grasp on cross-examination is helpful in the event that you ever have to go through the process. But then more than that, I think being someone who understands what cross-examination is and what sort of holes your opponent is looking for can make your extemp speeches more receptive and thus less likely to fall into those logical fallacies and less likely to fall into those traps. So I guess like the benefits are twofold then, right? One is helping you actually with cross-examination, but two, almost indirectly helping you out with the speech. Steve, Brian, do you have any other reasons why cross-ex might be useful or your experiences with cross-examination at other tournaments?
I think even in tournaments where you don't necessarily have to cross-ex opponents, if you're watching around, you're in the audience, it's always helpful to understand like what in their argument was missing, right? Because if you notice something that's like missing in someone in like a high-profile round, then you can definitely make sure to watch out for that when you prep speeches moving forward.
Yeah, also like when you're practicing and if you're doing practice preps, you can like honestly, after you've prepped and after you've given your speech, you can like cross-ex your own speech, right? You can like take a look at your own flow and say like, if I had to attack it, what would I attack this with? And if you're good at cross-ex, you can really become better at understanding your own weaknesses as a speaker and then fixing them.
Totally agree. And I think that, critical thinking could be like an equally apropos name for this presentation, because that's really what this is about. It's critical thinking. So the basics, cross-examination will last 2 to 3 minutes. It depends on the tournament. Does Nationals do a 3-minute cross-ex or is it a 2-minute cross-ex? Do you know, Brian or Steve?
Nationals has a 3-minute cross-ex.
Okay, yeah.
Are you sure? I thought there was the big thing because they wanted to make it 3. I mean, I've never been to Nats, but at NBA it's definitely 3, and they were talking about how that's the real cross-ex.
Yeah,
So
I think Nationals maybe
point
2
it's
minutes.
I think it's 3 minutes at Nationals.
Okay,
Well,
it's either
that's like the thing. It's confusing. So just know how long cross-examination is at the tournament you're attending. Like, let's say you make it to semifinals and they start to have cross-examination in semifinals. Would be useful to know. After you give your speech, you'll be sitting down and cross-examining the speaker after you. That means if you're the last speaker, you're technically going to be cross-examining the first speaker in the round. That's sometimes nice, though, too, because it means that you can get rid of the nerves of having to speak in front of a stage or an audience because you have the opportunity to cross-ex someone before you give your own speech. You will be given pen to paper to flow sometimes not. So I guess it depends. But you may not bring notes with you when you conduct the cross-examination period. So no reading off the legal pad and just looking down at your notes. Ideally, you want to be able to memorize your questions and then ask them. 3 to 4 is, I think, a generally good amount of questions to ask because you don't have too much time. So you're like most people, you're probably going to think then, I'm probably going to forget my questions. I have to memorize all of them. I can't reference my legal pad. So my general rule of thumb is that when your opponent gets to their conclusion, start memorizing your questions. Remember, you shouldn't be having too many either. You're not having 10. You should be having 4 to 5. Also, maybe memorize the tags of each point. That can be something else that's really helpful because then it can just refresh you on the arguments, okay? The other thing, too, is if you get stuck during the cross-examination period, a good way to just, like, refresh your memories, like, your third point said blah, 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 right? And let's say that's not exactly what their third point said, then they can clarify it, jogging your memory. And if you're right, that just gave you some stalling time to think about a question to ask. So those are some nice little strategies. Why does cross-examination matter? That's probably another question you're wondering. Because it doesn't seem like this is a debate thing. What does it have to do with extemp? So Put simply, you can't win a round during cross-examination, but you definitely can lose it. How well you ask cross-examination questions is often viewed as a tiebreaker between similarly skilled speakers. So let's say a judge is, they're stuck between deciding who's the one versus who's the two. Cross-examination can be that critical tiebreaker. Another thing is that not using your cross-examination time fully may count against you. You have to critique a 7-minute speech, so ideally you have at least a couple of questions you can ask. Now, how well you answer cross-examination questions, that varies from judge to judge. Some people might drop you a rank for a poor cross-examination, while others will drop you to last place. Typically, it's the judges who coach debate who tend to prioritize cross-examination more heavily in their rankings, so they'll be the ones more likely to drop you to last place, but there are no hard and fast rules. The point being this, you can't win a round because of cross-ex, but you definitely can lose it. Asking questions doesn't matter too much. It can be used as a tiebreaker, but other than that, it's more to humiliate your opponent, or not humiliate, I think that's a bad word to use, but I guess delegitimize their arguments. While answering cross-examination questions, that matters a lot more. You have to do a good job of that. Because if you can't defend your arguments from criticism, a lot of which your judges may also be having and your opponent is asking about, then you can lose the round. So cross-examination is also just a good time to address any lingering doubts around.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. One thing to keep in mind is like Anand says, like you can't win around, and I agree with that. Like in the sense, like if someone's speech was better than yours, that's what's going to matter, right? If there is a speech that I'm confused between for the 1 and the 2, and then one person has like a day and night better cross-ex like overall than the other, then that person will be getting the 1 in my book. Another thing to realize is like, as Anand said, it's not about humiliating your opponent. It's about politely showing that there might be some holes in their analysis. And typically, the way to do this is like ask them to like explain more, because this brings attention to the fact that they never explained in the first place. So like if there's a lack of clarity in one of their points, you want to ask like, could you explain this further? I don't think I fully understood it, because that really points out to the judge that, you know, these people did not really understand what the speaker was talking about. In that sense, extemp cross-ex you'll see is a lot more polite and professional than like debate cross-ex in any round. And that's one thing to keep in mind, right? I like to describe it as more like passive aggressive, right? Because sometimes it can like get passive aggressive, but like it's never fully aggressive. And when it becomes fully aggressive, you oftentimes get docked.
Yeah, exactly. In short, just don't be like a jerk with cross-ex. So I don't want to call out anyone, but there is one very particular national circuit extemper who graduated pretty recently. They were infamous for being a very rude person during cross-examination, and that showed during their ranks. You know, a lot of people, I don't know if Steve or Brian knows who I'm talking about, but a lot of people did not appreciate the way they asked questions. So don't be like that. The other thing, before asking any questions, always congratulate your opponent on an excellent speech. It's just like one of those weird extemp traditions where it's like, oh, it's viewed as polite. So you can be like, before I get started, congratulations on an excellent speech. I just have a couple of questions. That's something people do. Other ones, they make it a little bit more discreet. They'll just like briskly walk over, shake their hand, be like, whisper in their ear, like great speech, or say it like very quickly because they want to get onto the cross-examination questions.
I personally would recommend not to whisper in their ear. That looks a little odd.
Oh yeah, well,
Right.
not whisper. I mean, like more like great speech.
Yeah, right. Like as like the key there is like you say it quiet enough so that it's not weird, but like you say it loud enough so like the audience can hear, because like that's the key, right? You want people to hear that you're congratulating them, because like I don't know, like it's like the common thing to do, and like
Yeah.
it's the right thing to do. Like if you're in a round that's doing cross-ex, you're probably like final, semifinal, something like that. So yeah.
Pinnock also asked a great question. He said, during virtual cross-examination, should you still congratulate your opponent? The answer is yes. You can't like obviously handshake or anything, you know. Maybe even make a joke out of it, be like, virtual handshakes aside, congratulations on a great speech. I just have a couple of questions, and then go ahead with that. Or be like, or you don't even have to say like that part. I just have a couple of questions, go straight into the questions. But yeah, it's just the polite thing to do, part of like the weird history of Extemper tradition. Questioning strategies. So to inflict maximum damage, attack your opponent's impacts or bring up important facts they did not consider in their speech. So for example, like, I'm just trying to think of an example. It's really hard. Wait, Steve, Brian, do you have any good examples of this? Of like a good cross-examination question where you like attack an impact or an important fact they didn't bring up in a speech? Like maybe from personal experience?
Usually like if you know something that they don't, like if you're more well-versed, I would just be like, so I noticed in your second point that you mentioned X, right? But you failed to take into account Y, and this is like your background information coming in, but you failed to take into account Y, which could have this impact on X. How does that make sense in your speech or something like that? Like you want to end your question with something that attacks the legitimacy of their speech. You can say like, how does that contribute to your point or your question or your thesis or something like that, especially if you have information that they didn't bring up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that also makes you seem like 200 IQ because you're bringing in like another point. One thing I like to do is like if I've prepped the same speech that they're giving before, like if they're giving, like if I've prepped that before, typically I'll have like points in my head, right? And I'll be like, okay, I anticipate they're going to answer it this way. But if there's one significant point they missed out on, you can kind of have your own little sub point in there, right? You can say, you talk about these 3 points, but you fail to bring up the point of blank, which has this much of an impact, meaning it's significantly more important than what you bring up. Is there a reason why you chose these 3 over the one I bring up or something like that, right? That was pretty bad wording, but you want to be a little more professional, a little more polite, but talk about why they chose this over something that matters significantly more under your eyes.
So like, as an example, I think this is an okay one, I guess. But let's say the question is, should the United States recalibrate its approach toward Venezuela? And they're like, no, maximum pressure all the way. So you could be like, okay, just as an overarching question, Venezuela has historically had rather anti-imperialist roots. If the United States continues this pressure campaign of, this is redundant, maximum pressure, won't that just embolden anti-US sentiment, thereby ensuring Nicolas Maduro has popular support? Just something like that too. Like those overarching questions, those are fine, and then you can get into the specifics as well. Question any part of their speech that is vague or unclear. These are areas your opponent may not know much about. A good example of this was, I believe it was the 2016 or 2017 speech by, what's his name? Was it Marshall Sloan, Marshall Webb? I forget.
What speech was it?
It was the speech about bathroom bills in North Carolina.
Yeah, it's Marshall Webb.
Marshall Webb, okay. So he was giving this speech like, how should the United States federal government respond to like bathroom bills in North Carolina, I believe. And his second point, which he clearly knew was the weakest because he put it as the second point, right? That the crap sandwich, as people call it, was basically that the federal government should apply pressure to companies to leave North Carolina. But he didn't really have any specific solvency mechanisms because it's like, because that is a vague point, right? How can the private government, or how can the government apply pressure to private corporations over a statewide policy? So those sorts of vague parts you can attack and hone in on, like the solvency mechanisms. But how specifically can they do that? Like that's sort of what you want to ask it during cross-ex. If stuck, ask for specific quantitative details about your opponent's evidence. You said oil prices have dropped since 2012, but how much have they really gone down? One of two things either happens. Either one, they don't know, in which case you buy yourself some time, and in some judges' eyes, that looks a little bit unimpressive. Or two, they provide you some number. And if the number isn't super drastic, so like oil prices only dropped by $5 a barrel, then you can really attack the impact and be like, okay, so if oil prices have only dropped for $5 a barrel, how does this explain all of the economic catastrophes we're seeing in XYZ country? And then finally, planning one question per point is an easy strategy, but not required. My personal recommendation would be to hone in on the weakest point and tear it apart. Usually that's people's second point, but if you think another point is weaker, just go straight for it and just keep tearing it apart, right? Ask lots of questions about that until I guess it sort of runs dry. And if you have extra time, you can go to like another question on one of the other points. So lots of different ways with that. Steve, Brian, do you have anything to add for this slide?
No, I think you got it.
Brian?
Yeah, I think you're good.
Right, cool. So here's a general rule of thumb. You want to keep your questions as concise as possible, while still trying to flex some knowledge. So like a good example of this would be, let's say we're going, it's a question about US foreign policy. You could be like, ever since the 1940s, after World War II, the United States committed itself to being the world's policeman, someone who protected the multilateral liberal institutions of the world. However, throughout your entire speech, you propose that the United States ought to defund the World Bank Organization, one of those institutions that propped up United States foreign policy in the first place. So, how can we reconcile, I guess, that fact with the other fact that US foreign policy has been based on support of these multilateral institutions? Or something like that, right? My general recommendation is 4 sentences or less. Keep it really simple. You don't want to have like 40-second questions. That used to be the norm, where people would ask really long questions to flex their knowledge as long as possible. But you want your question to be a little bit more concise. Flex a little bit of knowledge.
Honestly,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd honestly go like 2 sentences or less, right? Because like some sentences can be long, like that's fine, but like
yeah.
2 sentences or less is typically my rule. And then like that way, if you ramble on and on, like it seems like you're not like ready for the questioning and you don't have them like memorized, or you're like trying to introduce unnecessary information. So like the flex there is like you were able to ask like the hard hitting question in like 2 sentences, right? And like
Yeah.
if you can, like if your opponent like struggles to answer it, then that's even like better for you, because then you just ask like one. It makes it seem like it's a simpler question, right? You have to think about that.
Yeah.
If you have like a 4-sentence question with like 2 sentences of background, it makes your question seem like a little more complex, and like that could warrant some thinking before like they answer. If you ask a quick question and they're still thinking about it, then that makes them seem a little weaker in terms of their analysis. So that's something to keep in mind.
I agree with that, Steve.
Perceptually, yeah.
If you can ask a question in 2 sentences, still flex a bit of knowledge, maybe you're like, ever since World War II, the United States has had a critical role in propping up institutions like the World Bank, something which has been integral to its legitimacy on the world stage. But if the United States defunds the World Bank, what does that mean for our international legitimacy, right?
Yeah, like that'd be a pretty good question to ask.
The point being this: you want to make sure that your questions don't seem too long-winded. Otherwise, you're going to get to this like point where it's honestly like, 1, the judge can't keep up with it, and 2, your opponent can't keep up with it. And that's just not a good look. Here's another one. So what if your opponent won't shut up? This is pretty rare in Extemp. Does happen though. It's happened to me. So if it does happen, smile as pleasantly as you can, then say, thank you so much. I understand your answer. And then do not wait for them to stop talking. Continue by saying, but what I really wanted to know about is, and then whatever you actually were trying to get at, right? That's like another thing, especially if you have other questions to get to. And you could be like, that's a great point. And using that as a segue to this thing, why don't we ask about blah, 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 right? So lots of different ways that you can do that. But yeah, if your opponent won't shut up, be like that.
I think something. So every one of my local tournaments has a cross-ex in the final round. So I've been like doing cross-ex a lot, and so like while it says this is a relatively rare problem in Extemp, I've had to like deal with it quite a bit. So like typically I'd say like interrupting your opponent is a lot harder than you may think, right? Because like you don't want to cross that line and seem a little rude. So something I've noticed that tends to like slow them down or like brings them to the end of their question is like if you start nodding and like nodding in a fashion that they can see that you're nodding and smiling, or like putting up a hand as if you're about to use like a hand gesture to ask a question, right? Not like putting up a hand like stop, right? That would be very, very rude and unprofessional. But like, yeah, putting up a hand to show like you're about to say something, it tends to have them stop because they're waiting on an out to like answer your next question, right? Because if they're rambling on and on, chances are they do not know what the heck to like answer your question with. So what you want to do is quickly move on to the next question, which they'll want, but you'll also want, because little do they know that your next question is also going to poke a hole in their analysis.
Yeah, and actually using that as a segue to two things. Number one, extem cross-sex is not like debate cross-sex. Don't spam them with questions or use jargon. That's just like another thing in general. A lot of people treat extem like debate, not only in cross-examination, but with their citations. It's like the Guardian tells us, like that's debate talk right there. Or they'll hand gesture to keep pacing. That's like debate hand gestures. And in cross-examination, debate cross-examination is like high speed, very quick, you're just getting through questions. Extem cross-examination is a lot more slow. It's a lot more polite. As Steve said, it's like that passive-aggressive sort of thing. Just don't spam them with questions. And then, right, also just don't use jargon. No one knows what the heck, like, PPE is, or actually most people do, but a lot of people don't. So, like, define that term. A lot of people don't know what the IMF is, so don't use those sort of jargon terms. Keep it simple, stupid, right? That's the phrase. So, think about it like that.
One thing I'd consider, like, I don't think I've ever done this, but like I'm thinking about this and it's pretty interesting to me. If your opponent did not define something in their speech, you can ask them to define it if it doesn't seem like they know what it is, or you could take an opportunity to say, like, considering like what you explain here, like the IMF or the intermonetary, like in whatever, like you could explain a definition of what they're giving, and then like maybe explain why they're wrong.
Yeah.
And that also be something to like take into account. Like if you define a term that they didn't, it like improves your knowledge while showing that they didn't have the clarity.
Totally. And I think that works well not only with like technical terms, but also subjective ones. The classic example I like to use is a Medicare for all healthcare system viable? Viable is a pretty subjective term, right? If they don't define it, use it as an opportunity in cross-sex to define it. Now, when most politicians talk about viability, they're talking about the practicality of implementing a Medicare for all healthcare system. Throughout this entire speech, you touch up on the moral imperative to adopt a Medicare for all system, but let's address that viable aspect. How practical would it be to totally upend our private-based healthcare system and replace it with the government? Sure. Something like that. That helps a lot during cross-examination. And it helps move the power dynamic back toward you, because you're in control and you're defining the terms, the operational terms of the question. Because if you define that term, you can define it in a selective way that excludes some of your opponent's arguments from answering the question, if that makes sense. Steve, Brian, you have anything to add on this slide for the past ones?
Nope.
Yeah, you're good.
Oh, okay, cool. So let's say you're the person answering the questions. Lots of different things can happen. If you need thinking time, ask them to rephrase the question, even if you perfectly understood it the first time. So like, let's say they're like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Has President Trump's anti-free trade approach hurt the United States' status with the European Union? You could be like, I don't know, Brian, or Steve, what's a good way of like rephrasing that? Is there like a good rephrase formula?
One thing I like to do is like ask like clarifying questions. I guess this isn't necessarily because I need thinking time. This is more so that like I can understand what they're trying to go at, and then I can answer directly what they're trying to go at. But like I'd say like, what was the question? It was like, has Donald Trump's policies hurt the relationship with what?
The EU.
The EU, right? So I could be like, I mean, it depends on what the question is, right? Because you could try to get out of it by saying, this doesn't really relate to the question, or you could say like, in what respect would you like say like it hurts the relationship with the EU if you're arguing that it didn't, something like that.
Yeah, totally.
Or another thing there is like, if it's like a yes or no question, you can sometimes get away with just saying like, no, right? I don't think so. And they just say, I just say no, and then they move on. They'll just be like, all right. So I think that's somewhat of a power move because you just answered in one word.
Yes, but I think it's a power move precisely because it's a risky strategy. So
Yeah.
Do
I
that.
mean, if you explain it in your speech, go ahead and give that one word answer. If that's something where it's like an opinion that's coming outside of your speech, then that's something will you will need to elaborate on so that the judges really know where you're coming from.
Yeah. Let's say that's another good, I guess, segue. Let's say they demand a yes or no question, but it's not a yes or no answer, or a yes or no answer, but it's not a yes or no question. Say what an excellent question. It deserves a much better answer than just yes or no. The other way I like to do it, to throw a little bit of shade at them, is like, I think it's fairly reductive to boil this down to a yes or no answer. Instead, we need to analyze the complexities of the situation by blah, blah, blah. And never say yes, but, because your opponent will cut you off before. Put the qualifier before your answer. So what would have followed that but part? Yes, but Medicare for all will save us $18 trillion compared to a private healthcare system. So you could be like, Medicare for all would save consumers $18 trillion compared to our current privatized healthcare system, which means, yes, it may increase the government's national debt, but we're also saving people money, right? Just something like that.
I think, yeah, go ahead. Finish what
Okay,
you
yeah.
said.
Putting the qualifier just prevents your opponent from cutting you off. And also, that's like the really important stuff anyway. And let's say you're like, it's nearing the end of your cross-examination. You want to put that important stuff up there first.
One speech to watch for this, it's like uh, Marshall Sloan won 2016 IX Nationals. If you watch his speech and then see how Nikhil Ramaswamy cross-exed him, and Nikhil Ramaswamy was like a god on the extemp circuit, right? But that was his first year finally at Nats, and he was very, very nervous. And whereas Marshall Sloan was like seasoned at that point, right? What you can see there is like he's really treading the line of being aggressive there. So there are some people must have thought that was a little too aggressive, but he does those really like one word answers, and then he like is able to like control that cross ex even though he's not the one asking those questions. And so like if you have like a speech where you're thinking your analysis is great, I think that's an approach you can take. And that's a pretty good cross ex round to watch if you're looking for that.
Yeah. That's on the NSDA website, though, so I think you'll need a login.
Yeah, you will need member privileges for that. Or like the resource package. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Brian, you got anything to add on the slide?
What I want to say is that this goes both ways, but you should never ask questions that write your opponent a blank check, right? So that's for asking questions. Basically, if you say anything along the lines of, in your third point, you said X, but you didn't explain it well. What did you actually mean? That's the worst question you could ask, because you're literally giving them time and space to elaborate on their speech and strengthen their argument. Likewise, if you ever get a question that seems like a blank check, if you ever get a question where they're saying like, your second point was a bit unclear, like what did you actually mean? Just use this time to strengthen your second point, right? Like, that's a pitfall that so many people fall into in cross-ex. Even at the highest levels, I've gotten ballots where and rounds where my opponents asked me a blank check or I asked a blank check question, and that's something you want to avoid, but you also want to take the opportunity of answering if it ever comes up.
Another thing that I wanted to bring up there is like speaking on like things you can say to like make yourself look better, is like on the lines of like, what an excellent question, it deserves a much better answer than just yes or no. If they point out like something that you did not bring up, but like that's a relevant issue, what I really like to say is like, thank you for bringing that up. That's actually an excellent point, and I wanted to touch upon that in my second point. And then you could talk about what they like ask you to talk about, right? Because then it seems like you wanted to talk about this, but you just didn't have the time or didn't like you forgot to or something like that. Whereas like it makes them seem like they asked a question that ended up like helping you. So that's something to keep in mind.
The other thing too is like the other way you can approach it's like, look, this doesn't actually fall into the purview of the question. Like one time, I remember I was being cross-exed about how to reform our prison system, and they kept talking about something like super irrelevant. I forget what it was. I'm like, I'd remind my opponent of the question and like just use that as an opportunity to repeat the question. And then be like, when we talk about this issue, which is certainly like a compelling one, it doesn't fall into that, I guess, like domain. And so just like say that in a more polished way, obviously. Don't ever say my opponent either. Again, it's not.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that.
But yeah. Don't ramble. Some people will try to give the longest possible answer in order to waste their opponent's cross-ex time. This is a bad idea because your judge will probably think you're being evasive, and that implies you have something to hide. So the longer you ramble, the more likely you'll say something damaging. Case in point, Donald Trump, right? So you want to make sure that you don't ramble. Don't pull a Donald Trump. Don't pull a Joe Biden. Keep your answer nice, short, and concise. You're not a politician, right? So you don't want to pull the long-winded answers. The one exception being this. If you do see the 30-second signal, that's usually like a C. Try to use the rest of your cross-examination time. Many competitors try to sneak in a damaging question at the end of cross-ex so that you won't have time to answer. So, yeah, if you see that 30-second signal, just keep on rambling till you see that fist. And then you're free to just chill. Question selection as defense. So your first priority is to choose a question you can answer well. If you have many good choices, so when I mean question, I'm not talking about questions you ask in cross-ex. I'm literally talking about the question you'll answer as a speaker. Looks like we have a question. Pinnock asks, if the opponent asks a question and the time runs out, do most judges allow you to answer it? Really depends. I think for the most part, what happens is they just don't consider the question and they'll just like not look at it, right? Because you didn't have an opportunity to answer it. But other judges want to consider the question because they think it's a good one, and they'll also give you an opportunity to answer it. I think it just depends on the judge's level of familiarity with Extemp and how technical they like to get and how content oriented they are. So, yeah. Oh, yep, no problem. So question selection as defense, right? Let's say you're the speaker. Your first priority should be to choose a question you can answer well. Let's say you have a lot of good choices, those gimme questions. Consider taking something with one clearly correct answer. Will Brexit be bad for the British economy? Almost definitely yes. Should transgender teens be able to use the restroom of their choice? Probably. Or choose something your opponent won't know about. What is Eritrea's economic outlook for 2018? Does your opponent know anything about Eritrea? Probably not. So having those sorts of questions can be really impressive. And I think that brings me to one more thing. We don't have a slide on this, but another really important thing is, and Steve, Brian, feel free to add your own bits of advice on this, but let's say your opponent chooses one of those questions, which you think is almost impossible to cross-ex. Like, how do you cross-ex, should transgender teens be able to use the restroom of their choice? Focus less on like the yes/no, like you can agree with their answer, yes, but then focus more on the specific reasoning they have, or like the specific solvency they may have, if that makes sense. That was a little bit more clear in my head, but Steve, Brian, do you have anything to add to that? When, let's say, your opponent chooses a question which is like really hard to cross-ex, because it's like a gimme one that's like super obvious, or a really obscure one?
Yeah, for sure. So, like, the one you're talking about, you would find this in like a domestic social round, and even then, this is a terrible question for a domestic social round. It's just not a good question that I would see many people writing. But if there's other controversial questions in there that, like, you know, are really, really straightforward, like, should the Violence Against Women Act be reauthorized? You know what I mean? Something like that. And they answer yes. You really just have to focus on like what they say in point 1, point 2, and point 3. And if you know anything about the topic, you still want to attack them on what they didn't cover. At this point, it's not about whether they answered the question in their thesis correctly, but it's really about like
Their focus.
Yeah, how they answered the question after that. And for the thing, like, if you don't know anything about, once again, it's kind of like dealing with like a question you don't know anything about. I don't know if Stephen and Anand gave that lecture in their labs yesterday, but you really want to just apply frameworks to the question. Like say, like, if I don't know about Eritrea, what do I know about the region? What do I know about? And then in their speech, you can maybe glean some facts about Eritrea, like what's their best export, what is their economy made out of, something like that. And then you can apply like similar frameworks to your cross-ex as well.
Here's the other thing too. Remember we said focus on the impacts and stuff. Be like, so like, or any parts of the speech that are vague. Usually you'll find those. It's really hard to do this without an example. So maybe what we'll do is we'll choose a question that's like on a pretty, like a question which I guess has like one clear answer to most people. And then we'll have you guys cross-examine that one as good practice. But yeah, you can focus on impacts and vague things as well.
Shivam, before we get to your question, I just wanted to talk about the I agree with the contentious questions, like definitely attack the analysis rather than the answer. Will make you seem like a lot better. The other aspect of this is the obscure questions. And so typically what I've noticed is like no matter like the question, if it's obscure to you, typically it'll be obscure to the person that's answering the question, right? Like I've been cross-exing some of the smartest extempers like across the national circuit, and like even they sometimes did not know what they were really talking about for these obscure questions. So like one time an extemper brought up like restructuring debt for a country, and I just asked them like simply like what restructuring debt means and what it would entail for the country and if they would be able to do it. And they started to struggle a little bit because they don't know the nuance behind that, right? They probably read an article that said they should restructure their debt because X, Y, and Z, but they didn't have the time to dive into detail for each one of their subpoints. So if you just attack them there, then it makes them seem like they don't really have the information they need when they're answering the question.
So answering the question in the chat, should you ever use humor in cross-ex questions or answers? Okay, it's harder to pull off, right? But it's super, super cool if you do. I think in 2018 Glenbrook's finals, I won that final round partly because of the cross-ex. Basically, if you have a joke that you forgot to use during your speech and an opportunity comes up to use it when you're being asked questions, by all means, do it, right?
If you're asking questions, though, you probably shouldn't bring up jokes.
Yeah, if you're asking questions, I don't see an opportunity to like make a joke there. But for sure, man, if you have a joke in your mind and you didn't use it in your speech because you forgot or something, and they ask you a relevant question, you can bust it out, right? And then someone messaged me privately. If someone uses a shady source, should you ask them about that during cross-ex? Now, I have mixed opinions on this one because generally, yeah, it should be fair game, right? Sure. But literally, like, at MBA, someone I knew, I was cross-exing, and they legitimately cited a wrong stat. I knew it. It was a Brexit question. I knew the stat. It was wrong. And then I called them on it. And then the judge was like, you shouldn't have spent so much time talking about that stat. It didn't really matter, even though it actually did matter. So the judge was completely wrong too. So but really I'm not sure how effective it is because even when I was attacking a blatantly wrong stat, it didn't do much for me. So a source is probably even less of a deal.
I want to show everybody an example of how asking a question with a humor can go wrong. I know it's one of Dylan Slinger's speeches. I just have to see which one it was. And the joke really did not land. I think it's this one. Let me know if you can hear the audio when I play it. Okay, wait. So first off, I want you to see like his little, like the walk and like the politeness part of it, I guess. Thanks. See? Very quiet congrats, right? Like not super loud, not like congrats, like and then just like a mellow congrats and like a handshake. Hug's fine too if you know the person well enough.
So I'd like to begin with a quote from the venerated political philosopher Soulja Boy. In his song Superman, he explains, "You can catch me at your local party, yes, I crank it every day." You speak of the Chinese military, which seems to not have dominance. However, a Korea Times article of
See, that's not what you want to do, right? That joke did not land. It was irrelevant. Didn't really have a point. The other thing
Yeah,
is,
it didn't really connect. Like,
Yeah.
if that could have been funny if it like kind of connected to the question, but
it didn't.
I don't think. I think he just said it to say it.
Steve and Brian, what are your guys' thoughts on using sources in questions? Because this guy did, and I don't think that's a good strategy, personally.
Dude, if you know a source, like if you're confident that you know more about the topic than they do and you have a source, like for example, I did a lot of reading on like Brexit and stuff. So I cited a source in those questions. And I think it definitely can work, especially if it's a stat that
What if
disproves
the
their
judge doesn't? But how do you know the judge knows the source is my question.
No, it doesn't matter because like if you cite like a statistic or like a number in your source that you remember that completely messes up the argument, then it's fine, right? I think.
Yeah, and if you're using a source, you do need a date on that. Looks like we have time to go over one, so I'm going to stop this recording. Stop share. Or I didn't mean to do that, guys.